Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
Mistress Edge's House of Horrors by P.L. McMillan. It was a typical cheesy haunted house. White paint flaking off the sides, boarded-up windows, and rotting rose trellises. It was a two-storied Victorian affair, complete with a widow's walk, despite there being no sea or even river nearby. The large French doors that led inside had been thrown open and were framed by two large bay windows. Cotton cobwebs and fake police tape had been strewn liberally about the railings. The only recent addition was a neon burlesque-style sign that blinked out the words, "Mistress Edge's House of Horrors." Eerie organ music crept from the century-old windows, and I could see strobe lights flashing in some of the rooms. It was only 7:30, so the sky was still light with the washed-out evening sun. Long, thin shadows draped over the house, the cracked sidewalk, and the 24 people waiting in line. The properties next to the old house were empty, weed-infested lots, so that the line was able to stretch into the one on the right. The lot on the left was a third full of the cars belonging to the individuals in line. Kyle Porter made his way back to me from the middle of the street where he'd been taking panoramic shots of the house and the surrounding area, as well as the excited faces of those in line. He bounced the camera in his palm. "Got 2 panoramas and some close-ups of the decorations. Want to get your intro done while we wait?" he asked. "Here?" I looked around me. The other people in line were looking up at the house, but I knew I would get attention by reeling out a spiel to a camera. "Why not?" Kyle cocked an eyebrow. He was a stupidly handsome man who knew how good-looking he was, which only served to make him more insufferable. He had never made it through college, just picked up a 1/4 of a degree in cinematography. Angela Burgess didn't care, though. He took decent enough shots and was happy to be paid below the industry standard. His blonde hair was artfully tousled. Cleft chin and defined jaw covered in just enough stubble to make him look like he didn't care how he looked. Of course, I could dig at him for his 1/4 of a degree, but I got my degree in journalism, and here I was 6 years older than he was and doing a fluff piece on a haunted house. Not only that, but it was my first real exposure piece. I had only written meaningless regurgitation articles needed to boost the website's traffic, pieces that said nothing in 500 words or less. This was the first real article Angela had assigned to me. I didn't even know where to start. I wasn't used to being in front of a camera, but Angela wanted a first-person view of the experience with commentary. I felt completely out of my comfort zone, but I didn't want douchebag Kyle to know that. "Let's wait until after. That way I can use the experience to tailor my opening a bit." He shrugged and took out his phone. He became absorbed in whatever it was he was looking at, so I took my time examining the other people in line. I pulled a notepad and pen from my purse in case I wanted to jot down notes about any standouts. For this advanced screening, I had assumed that most would be journalists, bloggers, and podcasters. Everyone seemed to fit this assumption, except for the group standing directly in front of me in line. These 4 were dressed in corsets, tight pleather pants, mesh shirts, and lacy skirts that barely covered anything. The 2 women had thick eyeliner, multiple pierced ears, and neon-streaked hair. The 2 men had gel-spiked hair, eyeliner, and facial piercings. I noted down their appearance and wondered what the group was doing here. This was supposed to be a press release review, open only to those publications and websites famous enough to be liable to generate the reviews the company wanted for their new business venture. Kyle was still engrossed in his phone. I leaned in and saw he was furiously swiping right on every girl that popped up on whatever dating app he was currently on. My curiosity got the best of me, so I shrugged past him, closer to the darkly dressed foursome. "Excuse me," I started. The 4 were bent over a book. It looked like a biography. On the cover was a large black and white picture of an older woman dressed in Victorian-era clothing, a slight smile on her face. "Hello?" I tried again. I caught the attention of one of the women, the one with a violent purple streak marking the left side of her hair. She turned to me and gave me the once-over. "Hello. I was hoping to ask you some questions." I hated how hesitant my voice was. Angela wouldn't be so timid. She would have burst into the group and taken over the conversation, guiding it the way that would be most advantageous to her article. The other three had turned to me. I felt their gaze heavy on my face. "Ah, yes, I'm Katie Marshall, writer for the Net Gazette." I swallowed hard. "I noticed that you don't seem to be part of the journalist crowd and was wondering about how you got invited." Even to me, my question sounded insulting, like they didn't belong. The man with the double eyebrow piercings, black hair, and mesh tank top grinned at me. His smile was wide, dazzling white, and welcoming. "For sure. I'm Charles. This is Amanda." He nodded at the purple-haired girl with the ultra-tight lacy corset and bulging breasts. He gestured to the man who stood beside him, who was clad in a black pleather vest over a pinstriped button-up shirt and matching tight pleather pants that jangled with heavy chains. "Kirk." This left the woman wearing the skin-tight crimson dress with a black underbust that exaggerated her tiny breasts. Complementing her outfit was a large skull tattoo that covered most of her left shoulder and arm. Her face was tinted with makeup to resemble a ghostly hue, her eyes darkened with black eyeshadow, and her brows artificially lengthened with a brow pencil. "And my girlfriend, B." I nodded and shook each of their hands. "This is Kyle, my cameraman." Kyle looked up from his phone and gave the women a head-to-toe examination with a wry grin. They stared back at him, unimpressed by his pastel polo shirt and designer jeans. "Are you for part of a podcast, or—" I led them on. "Us? No, not at all," Charles said. Kirk painfully squeezed his hand into the right-hand-ass pocket of his pleather pants, pulling out a crumpled pamphlet. He offered it to me with a shy smile. Taking it, I read the words, "Mistress Constance Edge, expert in Egyptian history and talented poetess," in Gothic lettering. Underneath was the very same picture I glimpsed in the book they'd been peering at. When I opened the pamphlet, I saw someone's enthusiastic attempt at making it read like a newspaper from the 1800s. At least 7 fonts had been used, interchanged with black and white pictures of the woman, her house, the pyramids, and a scarab. On the left-hand side was a poem, leaning crookedly against the margin. "From death's grip I take you back, frothing, twisting, wet with a rotting placenta. I smell the scent of the afterlife, a dank, dark musk of underground things. You're back, blood, bone, skin, but empty. I am not God, not omnipotent, not infallible. I'll take you as you are now. Take me as I am and forgive me my flaws." The middle had a short biography underneath, a cameo of Mistress Constance Edge herself. Born 1910, died 1989, Mistress Edge, maiden name Crowell, was a self-professed female explorer and poetess. She became enamored with Egyptian culture after the famous discovery of 𝐒𝐜𝐚 in 1922, and studied everything she could. After her marriage to Colonel Richard Edge at the age of 18, she joined him on his many trips to Egypt. On their trips to Cairo, Mistress Edge collected artifacts and the local legends, spending more time with the natives than her husband cared for. She tried many times to get her collection of folklore and stories published, but was rejected due to her gender. She took to writing the dark Gothic poems so many people love to this very day, publishing them under a pseudonym, Christopher Patterson. Her husband died 4 years after their wedding, without giving her a child. Unable to travel on her own as a woman, Mistress Edge returned to the family home. Her fortune rather well known, Mistress Edge had many suitors, but none who lasted. Most ghosted after courting her for however many months. The social circles gossiped she was too peculiar to wed again. She died alone in 1989. On the right-hand side was a hand-drawn ankh and the words, "Pamphlet produced by the Edge Society, established 2002. I closed the pamphlet and examined Mistress Edge's photograph again. She looked to be about 40, though the harsh sun of Cairo could have aged her prematurely. Despite the fuzziness of the old photograph, it was clear to see that her skin was dark, weathered, and lined. Even so, her eyes were bright, her smile alluring. She was dressed in a tight, striped dress with a scarab-shaped pin on the collar, just at her throat. I offered the pamphlet back. "No, keep it," Kirk said. "So, you guys are part of the Edge Society?" I tucked the paper into my purse. Kyle took a step back, camera rolling in his hands. "We are the Edge Society, the founding four. We have about 30 subscribers, though. We put out a poetry anthology based on her work. I was the editor," Bea said. "Oh, that's cool. What was it called?" Angela loved characters, so she would definitely get a kick out of this group. It could add a more personal touch to the piece as well. "The Gothic Edge." Bea whipped out her phone and pulled up an image on the screen. Kyle obliged by zooming in, taking a few seconds to record the black and white cover crowded with black roses, more onks, and a low, sickly moon. "I didn't realize this haunted house had such a rich history. But if you're not with a website or a podcast, how did you get an invite?" I asked. "Bea's cousin is banging the guy who is running this," Amanda smirked. "We couldn't pass up a chance to see the inside of Constance's house. All the original stuff is gone, of course, sold in auctions or donated to the museum here in town. It will be amazing to see the inside all the same," Charles said. "Did you hear anything about how they've decorated it then?" I was drawing a blank on questions. Angela would have been pulling out gems left, right, and center. Kyle looked bored out of his mind, and I was fairly sure I saw him zoom in on Amanda's chest. I resisted the urge to scold him. "My cousin said they went for the basic haunted house package. I'm sure it's going to be completely lame. They're leaning more on the house's reputation to bring people in rather than their abysmal theme choice," Bea said, sticking a clove cigarette between her lips. "How would you have designed it then?" I asked. Charles, Amanda, and Kirk all looked at Bea. It was obvious she was the leader of the society, with the anthology probably her idea as a way to get her own writing out into the world on the back of Constance Edge's. The Queen Bee. I smiled to myself as the Queen herself sucked at her cigarette. Then she looked at the camera and smiled. Her smile brightened up her whole face, making her gorgeous. "Obviously, I would capitalize on Constance's obsession with the occult and Egyptian mythology. I'd rely heavily on the curse of the pharaoh. People talked, you know. They thought a curse followed her back from Cairo, that a curse killed her husband because she was taking so many artifacts from the tombs. You can find old diaries and family logs in the town's library, and nearly all of them say so. I'd copy those entries and hand them out to the people in line, really stir up the anticipation. Even after Colonel Edge died, she kept all the artifacts and even had her husband's old friends ship her more. Everyone thought that the curse was to blame for her loneliness too, that it chased her suitors away and eventually drove her mad. Her poems, which I would make sure were posted on the walls inside, clearly showed her descent into senility. She went from grieving her husband to believing he was still with her, to mourning the fact she was alone, before going on about how life wasn't worth living without companionship. I'd carry on that theme in the house, all black, dark, thick velvet and symbolism, create the fear of death and hopelessness in the people, not cheap thrills. Bea smirked, dropping her cigarette butt onto the sidewalk and grinding the heel of one carefully scuffed boot on it. Scare them through hopelessness? I had never heard anything stupider. Bea nodded. Night was falling quickly now, and the streetlights clicked on and cast a sickly pallor on everyone waiting. The strobe lights in the house were more noticeable and jarring. Before I could tell him to, Kyle took some video of the night-stained building. At that moment, ethereal green spotlights lit up the front of the house, and the boom of thunder echoed out from hidden speakers. A woman dressed as Constance Edge stepped out from inside the house, her face a ghastly white and her eyes completely black. She waved at the crowd, and all around me, everyone cheered. "Welcome, my ghouls and ghosts," faux Mistress Edge said, her voice caught by the microphone in her hand. Bea looked at me and rolled her eyes. "I am your hostess, Mistress Constance Edge, and this is my house of horrors." There was a well-timed clatter at the windows as costumed employees inside the house pounded on them. "As you can see, my other guests are restless, so let's not keep them waiting." The crowd cheered again. "I know you've been waiting eagerly, but due to city ordinances, I can only host 10 of you at a time. So, let's get the first unlucky 10 inside." The crowd cheered again. I went on to my tiptoes and counted. I was number 9, just making it into the first round. I was glad for this. I wanted nothing more than to get this dumb thing over with so I could go hit up a bar. The line began to shift forward. Faux Edge greeted each and every guest with a curtsy. Kyle remained diligent and filmed the whole thing. "Welcome, my dears," Faux Edge said to the camera, curtsying even deeper. I slipped inside after the Edge Society. I found myself in the foyer, lit by a dim red light cast by small fake candles mounted on the walls. It was a large room, accommodating all 10 of us. Faux Edge followed Kyle in, closing the door behind her and taking her place as our tour guide at the head of the group. I started as someone ran across the length of the room above us, their pounding steps shaking the dust from the ceiling. From somewhere deeper into the house, someone cackled. I took in the decorations, a secondhand shop featuring scenic prints on the walls, a cracked side table off to the left holding a plastic skull, and the ceiling was heavy with more cotton cobwebs. A fuzzy stuffed black widow spider had been fastened where the overhead chandelier should have been. The floor was bare, damaged hardwood marked with glow-in-the-dark runners to guide the way through the house. "Follow me, my dears. I'll give you the tour of a lifetime." Faux Edge cackled and made her way to the back of the house, along the path of the glow-in-the-dark strips. "This is lame as shit. I knew it," the queen bee whispered in my ear. The next room was a long, musty hall lit by more fake candles. The double French doors off to the right had been nailed shut to deter wayward explorers. As our group of 10 passed a small closet, the door burst open. Several people screamed as an employee dressed in a skeleton costume jumped out at us. Though I had been expecting cheap thrills, I still started, cringing back against Kyle. "Watch the camera," he said. Around me, everyone laughed off their fright. "What can I say? I have skeletons in my closet," Faux Edge said. Most of the guests laughed. Bea was keeping at my side for who knew what reason. Maybe she thought I'd write about her anthology or the Edge Society and give it some publicity. "Stupid," she hissed in my ear. "I was expecting this to be bad, but not this awful. You can trust that I'll be writing them a bad review on Yelp. I'm sure you'll mention how overly disrespectful this whole thing is in your blog." "Website," I muttered under my breath. But really, on the internet, wasn't it all the same? The only thing that made a difference was ad revenue. Faux Edge drew us on. We went through the dark hallway and were guided into a dining room on the right, through another set of French doors. I heard some of those ahead of me screaming as someone or something scared them. Kyle pushed past me, holding the camera up and trying to get a good shot. Expecting a jump scare, I didn't even flinch when the 2 men dressed in fluorescent rags lunged out at me. The room was decked out with a half-dozen different colored strobe lights. I wondered if I should put in a trigger warning for any epileptics that might be interested in going to this attraction. 4 slim girls dressed as Victorian dolls lurched around the perimeter of the room, giggling and making clawing motions at the nearby guests. All in all, it was shaping up to be your typical haunted house. Past the dining room was the kitchen, complete with zombie chef and butler, and up the servant stairs to the second-story bedroom where a demon woman writhed on a 4-poster bed with a duo of masked cultists chanting around the bedside. I soon came to expect more jump scares, from inside the kitchen closet, under the bed, from behind doors and curtains, so I made notes in my notepad and watched everyone else react. Bea accosted me again in the bedroom, She seemed determined to give me her own version of a specialized tour. We stood at the back of the crowd while 𝐿𝐻𝐸𝐻 went on about how she was a scream in bed. The bound girl gave an obliging shriek for her joke. I managed to find an obscure diary in the town's library. It had been donated by the Hawthorne family and written by a great-great-aunt of theirs who had worked at the family pharmacy. In one of her entries on July 2nd, 1935, she mentioned receiving a sealed courier message from Mistress Edge. Judith Hawthorne, that was the great-great-aunt's name, didn't go into details, just that she went to this house to administer emergency services and gave Mistress Edge a couple of doses of opiates for any residual pain. Judith wrote another entry a week later, saying she went back to the house to check up on the widow, but was turned away at the door. I automatically made notes in my notepad, but was only half listening to her over the actor's screeches and chanting. But I dug deeper. Why didn't Mistress Edge go to the doctor? Why did she need emergency procedures at home? And why didn't she get the actual doctor? So, I asked some of the residents at the retirement home and found a couple of people who remembered the old spinster Judith Hawthorne. They said Judith could never get a husband because she wasn't respectable. They said she wasn't respectable because she often did backdoor abortions or secret deliveries for unmarried women. She would steal supplies from the pharmacy and even visit women in different nearby towns, B said, watching me as I wrote down her story into my notepad. I made a timeline. Her lover during that period was reported to be a traveling Bible seller, Patrick O'Hara. The records and old-timers had all agreed he left town in November the previous year, having stayed a month. He just up and left. Didn't even pay for the last week he stayed at the local hotel. A retired maid told me that he'd even left his box of Bibles behind. He must have been in quite the rush to get out of here. I think he got her preggo and ditched. She didn't leave the house much, so no one would have noticed her belly swelling. The baby must have died in childbirth because no one had ever mentioned it, and I couldn't find any records of an abandoned child. Maybe she buried it in the backyard or something. I stared at the bed, looking past the actors, and tried to imagine that poor woman all alone, struggling through the pain of childbirth in secret, only to have a dead child in her arms. I pitied her. I couldn't blame her for writing such dark and lonely poetry. Great. I was in a haunted house attraction and I felt more sad than scared. Bee's eyes were twinkling, or maybe it was the strobe light. It was obvious she was proud of all the information she'd gathered, all the secrets she had dug up. If it were all true, of course. It could make a good scandal sidebar for my video if Angela would allow the speculation. We toured through 2 more bedrooms, a study, and a bathroom, where voodoo priestesses, zombies, crazed lunatics, and more Victorian doll ladies waited, until we were led down the main stairs descending to the landing. Thousands of glow-in-the-dark streamers hung from the ceiling, vibrant in the black light. The landing contained an entrance to the second set of stairs descending into the basement. All the other doors leading to the rest of the house had been boarded up. I couldn't suppress a shudder. The tour obviously ended in the basement. Bee pushed past Kyle to lean into my ear. 𝐿𝐻𝐸𝐻 went on and on, layering on a heavy coating of puns and corny jokes. I can't believe it. I didn't think they'd let us in the basement, but this is amazing. That's where they found her. Mistress Edge, I mean. She was dead in the basement for a week before the milkman called the police when he saw that she wasn't collecting the milk. They busted down the door and searched the house. The police found her in the basement, where she kept her most prized Egyptian relics. Bee's breath was hot and sour on my face. She was panting with excitement. She'd lost it at the end, completely batshit crazy. After her last lover, Mr. Roger Bartholomew, disappeared, she completely secluded herself. Widowed, abandoned 3 times by lovers, she couldn't deal with it. They say she drank laudanum. The poison made her delusional, and she crawled to the basement, where she took down her hooks and palm wine, her balsam saps and tree resin, and her yards and yards of linen, and then she tried to mummify herself. Straight up tried to mummify herself. She died having wrapped herself up to her waist in resin and linen. Her lips brushed against my earlobe, oddly sensual, and I shuddered again. The group was going down the narrow wooden steps one at a time. Bea slipped in ahead of Kyle, grabbing Charles's hand. I realized I was shivering. I was the last one on the landing, looking down the purple-lit stairwell. The lights were set to a low pulse, causing the shadows to throb across the walls. The guests' silhouettes were grotesque ghouls dancing against the stone. Kyle poked his head around the corner and looked up at me. He was laughing, or grimacing. I forced myself to descend. Even over the low, deep, bass-heavy music piping in through some hidden speakers, I could hear the old wooden stairs creaking under my weight. I pictured myself plunging downward as one collapsed, of being impaled on the splintered wood. I hopped down to the floor from the third last step, my heart thudding in my ears. The basement was huge, the entire width and length of the house. The floor was packed dirt, its walls rough stones. At the other end, where it would open onto the side yard of the house, was an upward opening door. A bright exit sign had been affixed above it, and the glow-in-the-dark guidance strips led right to it. Black fabric had been hung from hooks in the ceiling, along with black lights and foam body parts that swung gently. A smoke machine, hidden somewhere in the shadows, spewed out trails of chilly smoke that caught up around my ankles and swirled up my calves. Metal shelves had been bolted to the walls. On the shelves were plastic skulls with light-up eyes, sealed jars with prop hearts, eyeballs, brains, and toy rats. On others were books, hooks, knives, and tiny replicas of the pyramids. In the corner, directly across from the stairs and lit up with a ghastly green light, was a life-size sarcophagus propped up against the wall. I could faintly see 3 or 4 more spread out along the length of the room. I could only assume that actors were waiting inside, intent on scaring the guests. "Welcome to my last and most important room, my basement laboratory, where I practiced my dark arts, learning from Egyptian priests in the sands of Cairo," 𝐒𝐽 cried, spreading her arms wide. I slid more toward the right, closer to the exit, to get a better view of the finale. Perhaps, as well, to be, in fact, closer to the exit. Kyle was multitasking, holding the camera above the heads of the other guests, while also typing away on his phone. The air down in the basement was heavy, damp, cold, and thick with the smell of mildew. "I was obsessed with dark arts, you see. All alone in my house, struck with a gloomy disposition, I was drawn to evil and it to me." Our host ran a hand down the side of the sarcophagus slowly, seductively. Bea looked over her shoulder at me. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could only assume that she was rolling her eyes or making a sour face. "During my last years on this earth, I craved power, craved immortality. There's nothing more immortal than living on, preserved in resin and linen, forever and perfect. Look at my poetry and you'll see, hear and taste my madness. I put my words of power in these poems. Listen to the very last poem written, found in this very house, written in blood on a scrap of paper clutched in my hand. The policeman who found it kept it. His grandson then sold it online for quite the penny to the very same man who has brought my house back to life around you." I saw Bea perk up. She stood on her tiptoes, hand on Charles's shoulder, trying to see over the heads of everyone else. The other members of the Edge Society whispered to each other, pulled out phones, and started filming. "Repeat after me, my ghoulish friends, so that we can maximize our power in this hallowed place of mine," said 𝐒𝐽. I sighed, knowing a finale when I heard one. I could guess that the actor's cue was when we finished the poem, and I could only hope it was a short one. "Anubis, I channel you," she began, and the guest repeated her words back. "Great and dark is your touch." I listened to everyone chanting along. With the shadows cloaking them, everyone looked like cult members praying to some dark demon. I could see that even Kyle was mouthing along, a grin on his cookie-cutter beautiful face. I thought about writing down the words of the poem to put in my piece, but figured the video would be good enough. See my skin and bones and flesh, weigh my heart and soul and mind. Find me worthy, find me your willing supplicant. I thought about Constance Edge, down here in the dark, wrapping herself with linen and resin, lost in the fog of the poison she'd ingested, driven to suicide by her lonely life. She found comfort in Egyptian mythology. It had brought something more to her life, even though it couldn't save her from herself in the end. Raise me up in your arms, bring me up, raise me, save me, save me. I jumped when I felt a hand on my arm. Who else but Bea, standing by my side again. I can't believe this. I was the last bidder for that poem until some anonymous buyer got it last minute. Now they're using it as some sick prop for their haunted house when it should be cherished for the treasure it is. I am so furious. You need to share this in your newspaper. Really rip into them for shitting on Constance's memory like this, she said, not caring that she was talking over faux edge. This doesn't sound like a poem. Osiris, I channel you. That's because it's not. Not really. In the last year of her life, Constance didn't publish any more poems. She didn't even really write to them. She wrote papers on Egyptian funerary rites and their idea of the afterlife. She was so fanatical, she thought their gods were real and had the power to grant rebirth to their most loyal followers. In one of her papers displayed in the town museum, she claimed to have written a prayer she knew would work. Bea said, "This must have been that prayer. Hot and searing burns your gaze. See my intentions, pure and true. See my devotion unwavering." So, she wanted to die and come back to life? To a life she hated enough to kill herself? I asked. I felt Bea shrug, her shoulder brushing against mine. Weigh my worth, weigh me true. Let me pass beyond the gates of death. It doesn't really make sense, I agree. Did you feel that? Bea asked. I looked at her. She was peering down at the ground. I looked down between my feet and saw nothing. It felt like a mini earthquake or something, she said. Let me pass. Let me pass. Let me pass beyond the gates of death. The chanters were done. Underneath my flats, I felt a small tremor. Panicked thoughts ran through my head, images of an earthquake hitting the house and it crashing down on us. I pictured myself being crushed by the heavy wooden beams above me or under the sheer weight of rubble. I took a step toward the cellar storm door. I hesitated. I couldn't see clearly through the darkness and the fake fog, but the hard-packed dirt floor was cracking, heaving upward in dry chunks. It was the vibrations of the earth moving that I felt under the thin soles of my shoes. Underneath the music and the laughter of the guests, I could hear the dry dirt being pushed up. Bea? Bea, look! I reached back blindly, trying to grab her arm. Was this some elaborate hoax? The big twist at the end of the tour? The showstopper? Bea's thin, cold hand gripped mine tightly, and painfully so. She pulled me back, away from the exit, and clutched at my shoulder with her other hand, hiding behind me. Shit! What is that? What is that? She said, her voice high-pitched in my ear. Part of the show. Maybe there are trapdoors under the dirt, I said. I heard several screams and spun around. A scantily clad woman, dressed in an Egyptian-themed skirt and bikini top, eyes lined thickly with black, had jumped out of the closest sarcophagus. More actors must be waiting under the ground in trapdoors and in the others, I reassured myself. I looked toward the exit. So close, just across the dirt floor that was cracking open. 3 pale figures were pulling themselves out of the ground. They were wrapped tightly in linen strips, stained by the dirt that had acted as their coffins. Bee's nails dug into my shoulder and hand, and she stumbled back against the wall, pulling me with her. 𝐿𝐻𝐻 gestured toward the exit, a coy smile on her face. Everyone else turned and began to make their way toward it, brushing past the draped fabric and fake body parts. The mummies stood, broad-shouldered and of varying heights. Beyond them, a smaller figure struggled against the dirt. Its infant limbs were swaddled in the dirty linen as well. Its tiny head flopped weakly on the floor. "Oh, that's sick. Sick. So sick," Bee was whimpering. One of the other guests pointed at the mummies, laughed, and half turned toward the rest of the group. The mummies swayed on their feet. One reached out and clawed at the fabric wrapped around its face, scratching at it. "We should leave. We should run past them," I said. "We need to get out of here." I wondered how much shit Kyle would give me for panicking and bolting out of this lame haunted house. I wondered if Angela would ever be able to take me seriously when he told her how I had fled. I faltered, took a step, and stopped. 𝐿𝐻𝐻 had stopped too, her hands up to her face. Her back was to me, but I watched her shoulders tense. I saw her take a step back. She reached out to the group as they went on. "Charles?" Bee screamed. Her boyfriend was stepping past the first mummy. At the sound of her voice, he looked over his shoulder. The mummy reached up and grabbed the thin boy's throat, lifting him up toward the ceiling. "Charles, no!" This time it was me restraining her, pulling her back. I heard the crack of Charles's neck over the music. His body dropped. The mummies lunged. It was chaos. I couldn't think over the screaming. 3 more bodies dropped. The actors in the sarcophagi had stepped out, drawn by the noise. Kyle turned. I saw the gaping hole of his screaming mouth. I saw the mummy grabbing him by his shoulders, the linen around its mouth stretching and ripping as it opened its jaws and sunk yellow teeth into his neck, staining its linen red. The other guests floundered in the hanging fabric. Some fell over as their legs became twisted. Others trampled those on the ground in their attempt to flee. 𝐿𝐻𝐻 shoved past me, screaming as I fell against Bee and we tumbled to the floor. Our host left us there, and I heard her screams echoing through the first-floor rooms as she fled. "It's them! It's her lovers!" Bee was crying into my hair. The 3 mummies had the last 3 victims in their arms, biting into their flesh and breaking their bones. Charles was one of them. He fell weakly to the ground without even a whimper, his glistening eyes staring at us. Kyle was clutching his neck, trying to drag himself away from the monsters with his free hand. He was mouthing something at us, at me, blood bubbling at his lips. "They didn't leave town. Fuck, they never left at all." I ignored her and stood, pulling her to her feet. The sound of us standing, our limbs scraping up against the stone wall, grabbed the dead men's attention. All 3 cocked their heads, listening in unison. I held my breath and prayed that Bee was too. The tallest one was holding a thin woman by the hair, and she hung limp. The other 2 dropped their victims, another woman, this one stockier, and a young man with red hair and a face stained crimson with blood. They stood, blinded by the linen wrapped around their eyes, and listened. My whole body was shaking, and I couldn't get it under control. I knew that if I made even the tiniest sound, they would start toward us. Kyle had stopped too, hand wrapped tightly around his own neck, head turned away from me, and looking at the still mummies. Then he coughed, blood splattering across the dirt floor. He shot me a single, terrified look, and then the mummies were on him, tearing and clawing at his flesh. I turned my back on his convulsing body and pulled Bee up the stairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. The stairs thundered with our escape, and the mummies opened wide their rotten mouths, chasing us with their howls. Bee was dead weight, dragging me back, but I refused to let go. I pulled her up to the top of the stairs and through the circuitous route that we had followed to get there. "She killed them! Oh, fuck! She mummified them!" Bee sobbed. I jerked on her arm to shut her up as we ran through the second-floor rooms. This place was a fire hazard with its boarded-up windows and doors, only 2 exits to speak of. The employees we'd seen on our way in were gone. They must have panicked when Faux Edge came through, panicked and left the guests behind. "Constance!" came a gurgling roar behind us. Against my better judgment, I looked back over my shoulder. The largest mummy had caught up, its linen splattered with blood, its mouth full of broken, yellowed teeth and a squirming, rotting tongue. It reached out for us, reached out for the woman it thought was us. The floor was gone, my left foot encountering only air, and then I was tumbling down the servant stairs to the first floor. My head slammed against a wall and my vision blacked out. I felt myself hitting the walls, the stairs, finally coming to a bruised rest at the bottom. I felt hands on me and tried to scream, but my wind had been knocked out of me. "Get up, you dumb bitch! Get up!" I was pulled to my feet, yanked away from the stairs. My vision faded back. It was now Bea leading the way. Her surprisingly strong hand gripped my wrist as we wound our way through the final rooms. "Constance!" the mummy howled. Somewhere upstairs, the two other mummies joined in its howl. My eardrums pounded with the sheer volume of their rising voices, unearthly, spectral, supernatural. In the foyer, I saw blue and red lights flashing through the windows that flanked the front doors, which had, thankfully, been left open. Bea dropped my wrist, her long legs carrying her through the doorway and into safety. I lost momentum, my legs seemingly made of lead as I tried to catch up. I felt a wrenching pain in my scalp as my hair became entangled in something, and my legs flew out from under me as I was jerked backward. Falling, I stared up at the blind face of the mummy that had caught me. Its one gnarled and clawed fist was gripping my hair while the other began to reach for my face, even as I hit the floor. I heard two loud bouts of thunder and saw a thick, black spray erupt from the back of the mummy's head, painting the ceiling above an ichor. The violence of the attack threw back its head, flinging it away from me and onto the floor, a handful of my hair with it. I scrambled to my hands and knees, scuttling away. Rough hands hooked under my armpits, jerking me to my feet. Through tear-blurred vision, I saw a cop before he shoved me, unceremoniously, through the front door and out into safety. Paramedics were waiting on the front lawn, lost in the visual confusion of tears, flashing lights, and the explosion of phone camera flashes. I let myself be led to the seclusion of an ambulance. Bea was wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the fender. Her shaking fingers held a clove cigarette to her lips. I sat next to her, accepting the cigarette when she passed it to me. Behind us, in the body of the ambulance, the paramedics fussed around gathering whatever they needed to tend to the gaping hole where some of my hair used to be. A warm trickle of blood slipped down my forehead and into my eyebrow. The cigarette smoke filled my lungs and sent a pleasant buzz to my brain. My whole body was shaking and felt completely numb. "Sorry, I didn't mean to just ditch you. I wasn't thinking, especially after you saved me," Bea said, not meeting my gaze. I shrugged, then flinched at the distant sound of more gunfire. I wondered if they'd shot Constance's mummy baby. I thought of what would happen next. This was something spectacular, something horrifying, something the public would be desperate to know about, so I knew I could expect police interviews, a media circus, the world's attention. I began to grin. This was my break. Even if it was just for a moment, I was going to be famous. And if I played this right, I could capitalize on it and make a fortune. I ducked my head down as I felt myself shaking, on the brink of giggles. Images of talk shows, interviews, maybe even a book based on my experience, flashed before my eyes. Me, the fearless reporter. Bea, my Judas. I sucked in a steadying breath. Angela had always said that audiences loved a survivor story. "I can't blame you," I said. I made sure my grin was gone before I looked up at Bea. "Why don't you give me your contact details? It would be good to keep in touch." It was only when she had entered her number into my phone, then staggered away to call her parents, that I buried my face in my grimy hands to stifle my elated laughter.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.